A secret marriage is exposed, leading to an explosive reaction from the millionaire's wife that sets the stage for an unforgettable twist. And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The New York winter of 1962 cast long shadows through the Harrington mansion's library windows. Thomas Harrington, 45, stood near his mahogany desk, watching Angela Miller, 32, organize books on the upper shelves. Their usual comfortable silence felt different that evening, charged with unspoken words. "Angela, could you help me find the Hemingway collection?" Thomas asked, his voice steady despite his racing heart. As she descended the ladder, their eyes met. 10 years of working together had built a foundation of trust and understanding, but recent months had shifted their dynamic. "Third shelf from the bottom, Mr. Harrington," Angela replied, her fingers brushing against the leather-bound spines. The contact was brief when their hands met, reaching for the same book, but it sparked something neither could ignore. Thomas cleared his throat. "After all these years, I think it's time you called me Thomas." His words carried weight beyond the simple request. Angela's hand trembled slightly as she withdrew it. "That wouldn't be appropriate," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. The distinction between employer and employee had been blurring for months. "Nothing about this is appropriate," Thomas responded, taking a step closer. "But I can't pretend anymore. These feelings, they're real, Angela." The confession hung in the air. Angela's response came in a whisper. "We could lose everything." "Or gain everything," Thomas countered, reaching for her hand. 2 weeks later, they stood in Central Park's conservatory garden. The early morning mist provided cover as Thomas's longtime friend and lawyer, James Patterson, witnessed their exchange of vows. Angela wore a simple blue dress, Thomas a dark suit without fanfare. The ceremony lasted 10 minutes, marked by honest words rather than elaborate promises. "Thomas, take you, His voice carried certainty despite the weight of what they were doing. Angela's responses were clear, unwavering. They signed the marriage certificate with steady hands, aware that this document could either protect or destroy them. James tucked the certificate into his briefcase with a solemn nod. "I'll file this discreetly. Congratulations, both of you." He departed quickly, leaving the newlyweds in their momentary bubble of joy. That evening, Thomas returned home alone. They'd agreed Angela would continue her normal routine to avoid suspicion. Elizabeth Harrington waited in the foyer, her social smile firmly in place, but her eyes sharp with scrutiny. "Late meeting?" she asked, noting his slightly disheveled appearance. "Investment review with James," Thomas replied, the half-truth bitter on his tongue. Elizabeth's perfectly manicured fingers tapped against her glass of bourbon. "You've been having a lot of those lately," she observed, her tone deceptively light. "And Angela seems different. More confident, perhaps?" Thomas maintained his composure, years of business negotiations serving him well. "She's been taking night classes. Self-improvement is admirable in our staff, wouldn't you say?" Elizabeth's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Indeed, though some might forget their place in the process." She turned away, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Don't forget we have the Hendersons gala next week. Your presence is expected." The threat in her words was subtle but clear. Thomas watched her disappear up the grand staircase, aware that their carefully constructed plan might be more fragile than they'd imagined. In his pocket, he touched the simple gold band he couldn't wear yet, feeling the weight of their secret pressing down on him. Angela, meanwhile, prepared the evening tea service in the kitchen, her own ring hidden beneath her uniform gloves. Their eyes met briefly as she served, 1,000 words passing in silence. The game they'd chosen to play was dangerous, but in that moment, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and society's expectations, both felt that their love was worth any consequence that might come. The morning light filtered through the study's heavy curtains as Elizabeth slammed a newspaper onto Thomas's desk. Her hands shook with barely contained rage, her diamond rings catching the light like shards of ice. "Explain this," she demanded, pointing to a small announcement in the public records section. Though the notice was deliberately vague, Thomas recognized James's careful phrasing of the marriage filing. His stomach tightened, but his face remained impassive. What exactly needs explaining? He asked, buying time as he scanned the words he'd hoped wouldn't be discovered so soon. Elizabeth's laugh was sharp, brittle. Don't insult my intelligence, Thomas. I've watched you for months. The late meetings, the whispered conversations, the way you look at her. She spat the last word like poison. Your maid? Really? You've lost your mind. Angela is my wife now, Thomas stated firmly, standing to meet Elizabeth's gaze. This isn't a discussion about staff assignments. Elizabeth's hand struck the desk with enough force to rattle the crystal decanter. Wife, you're still married to me, or have you forgotten that minor detail? Do you understand what this will do to us? To your reputation? To our position in society? Our marriage ended years ago, Elizabeth. We both know that. But we had an arrangement, she hissed. You kept your discretion. I maintained our social standing. This is beyond acceptable. When the board hears about this. Are you threatening me? Thomas's voice dropped dangerously low. I'm promising you consequences, Elizabeth replied, her composure returning like a mask sliding into place. You have until the end of the week to end this farce, or I'll ensure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are. From the hallway, Angela heard every word, her hands pressed against her mouth to keep silent. The silver tea service she'd been about to deliver sat forgotten on her cart as Elizabeth's threats echoed in her mind. Later that evening, in the small apartment Thomas had secretly purchased for them, Angela paced nervously. Maybe this was a mistake. I never meant to cause such chaos in your life. Thomas watched her from the modest sofa, his tie loosened, looking more relaxed despite the day's confrontation. Angela, stop. Come here. He held out his hand, waiting until she took it before pulling her close. Elizabeth was always going to react this way, he continued. She's built her life around appearances. But I built my life around empty promises and social obligations. With you, I finally understand what it means to be truly alive. Angela's fingers twisted in her simple cotton dress. But your company, your position, can be rebuilt, Thomas interrupted. Money can be earned again. But finding someone who sees past all that, who challenges me to be better, that's rare. He cupped her face in his hands. I'm not ashamed of loving you, Angela. I won't let Elizabeth or anyone else make me feel that I should be. Angela leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his conviction. The other servants are already whispering. Mrs. Patterson won't look me in the eye anymore. Let them whisper, Thomas replied. We knew this wouldn't be easy, but we'll face it together. He kissed her gently, then pulled back with a slight smile. Besides, I've already instructed James to begin divorce proceedings. Elizabeth's threats are just that, threats. Yet later that night, as Thomas slept beside her, Angela stared at the ceiling, Elizabeth's words playing on repeat in her mind. She understood now that their fight wouldn't just be against society's prejudices or legal obstacles. They were up against a woman who had everything to lose, and Angela knew from experience that desperation made people dangerous. She turned to watch Thomas sleeping, his face peaceful despite the storm brewing around them. Angela had spent years serving people like Elizabeth, learning their ways, understanding their power. Now, she would need to learn how to fight them, not just for her love, but for her survival in a world that would see her as nothing more than an interloper who dared to reach above her station. Elizabeth moved through the mansion like a shadow, her presence making the staff increasingly uncomfortable. She cornered Martha, the elderly cook who had served the household for 20 years, in the kitchen during the quiet afternoon hours. Tell me about Angela's background, Elizabeth demanded, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes cold. Surely in all these years, she must have shared something about her family, her past. Martha wiped her hands nervously on her apron. Miss Angela's always been private, ma'am. Keeps to herself mostly. Does her work well. But surely you've noticed changes? Elizabeth pressed, casually examining her manicured nails. New clothes, perhaps? Unexplained absences? I wouldn't want to speak out of turn, ma'am, Martha replied, but her hesitation told Elizabeth everything she needed to know. The staff knew more than they were saying. Elizabeth's investigation continued throughout the week. She questioned the gardener about Angela's comings and goings, the chauffeur about any unusual trips, and even the weekend maid about changes in Angela's bedroom. Each conversation added pieces to a puzzle she was determined to complete. Meanwhile, Angela found herself drawn to a different part of the city. During one of her afternoon breaks, she noticed a group of women entering a weathered building in Harlem. The sign read Women's Community Alliance for Progress. Curiosity pulled her toward the open door, where she heard passionate voices discussing voting rights and equal employment. Inside, she discovered a world she'd only glimpsed through newspaper headlines. Women of different backgrounds sat together, planning protests, writing letters to legislators, and supporting each other. A tall woman with graying hair noticed Angela hovering in the doorway. "First time here?" she asked, introducing herself as Dorothy Williams, the group's leader. "We always welcome new faces." Angela hesitated. "I was just passing by." "Nobody just passes by here," Dorothy said kindly. "They come because something in their heart tells them it's time for change." The conversation stayed with Angela long after she left, planting seeds of possibility in her mind. Thomas, however, faced his own battles in the upper echelons of New York society. During a private club lunch, his longtime associate William Henderson broached the subject delicately. "There are rumors, Tom," Williams said, swirling his brandy. "Uncomfortable rumors about your domestic situation." Thomas maintained his composure. "Are we discussing business, will, or gossip? They're one and the same in our world. You know that." William leaned forward. "The merger with Richardson Industries, they're conservative people. Traditional. If these rumors reach them, my personal life is my own," Thomas replied firmly. "Not in our circles," William countered. "Everything we do reflects on our businesses, our partnerships. Elizabeth has been reaching out to board members, sharing concerns about your judgment." Thomas felt the noose tightening. His marriage to Angela wasn't just challenging social norms. It was threatening the empire he'd built over decades. The thought of losing everything made him question his choices, if only for a moment. That evening, he watched Angela reading a book about civil rights in their apartment, her face animated with new purpose. She'd been different since visiting that community center, more aware of the world beyond their personal struggle. "We could leave," he offered suddenly. "Start fresh somewhere else." Angela looked up, understanding in her eyes. Running won't solve anything. These prejudices exist everywhere. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Besides, maybe we're exactly where we need to be, fighting this fight." Thomas sat beside her, taking her hand. "The board meeting next week. They might try to force me out. Then we'll face that too," Angela replied with newfound strength. "But we won't hide." As they sat together in their modest sanctuary, both were unaware that Elizabeth's investigation was about to uncover something that would shake their foundation. In her relentless pursuit of ammunition against Angela, she'd stumbled upon a detail that could change everything. A connection to a past that Angela had carefully buried, one that even Thomas didn't know about. The clock on their wall ticked steadily forward, counting down to revelations that would test not just their love, but their very understanding of who they were and what they stood for in a world determined to tear them apart. Angela sat in the back row of the Women's Community Alliance meeting, absorbing every word. Dorothy Williams stood at the front, discussing their latest campaign for equal employment rights. The room hummed with determination and shared purpose. "Our latest petition has gathered over 500 signatures," Dorothy announced. "But we need more visibility, more voices willing to speak up." Her eyes found Angela's. Sometimes the most powerful stories come from those who've crossed society's invisible lines. After the meeting, Dorothy approached Angela. "You're Thomas Harrington's wife, aren't you?" At Angela's startled look, she smiled. "News travels, especially news that challenges the status quo. Your marriage, it represents everything we're fighting for." "I never meant to become a symbol," Angela admitted. "The best symbols are those who didn't seek the role," Dorothy replied. "They're authentic, real." She handed Angela a pamphlet about upcoming demonstrations. "Think about sharing your story. It might give others courage." Meanwhile, across town at the Metropolitan Club, Elizabeth orchestrated her first public move against Angela. The occasion was a charity luncheon attended by New York's most influential women. As ladies in expensive dresses sipped champagne, Elizabeth held court. It's not just about the impropriety, she said, her voice carrying just far enough. It's the deception. The poor man was clearly manipulated. She worked in our home for years, gaining his trust, waiting for her moment. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, leaned in eagerly. Surely there must be something in her past? Oh, there's always something, Elizabeth smiled, dropping her voice conspiratorially. My sources suggest she's not as innocent as she appears. In fact, there might be radical connections. The whispers spread like wildfire, each retelling adding new embellishments. By evening, the story had evolved to include accusations of theft, suspicious associations, and questionable morals. That night, Thomas hosted a business dinner at Delmonico's. Angela accompanied him, dressed elegantly, but simply in a navy blue dress. The hostile atmosphere was immediate. Wives who had previously been cordial now turned their backs. Men who jovially slapped Thomas's back now offered only curt nods. During the first course, Mrs. Richardson, wife of Thomas's potential business partner, made her position clear. My husband mentioned your unusual domestic situation, Mr. Harrington. We find it quite concerning. Thomas's hand tightened on his fork. My marriage is not up for discussion, Mrs. Richardson. Everything is up for discussion when it affects business, Mr. Richardson interjected. Our shareholders have certain expectations about the company they keep. Angela sat straight-backed, maintaining her dignity despite the barbs. She'd learned from Dorothy about the power of composure in the face of prejudice. Still, each subtle slight, each whispered comment, each turn back felt like a physical blow. Perhaps I should powder my nose, she said quietly, needing a moment of respite. In the ladies' room, she overheard two women speaking. Elizabeth showed me the evidence herself, one whispered. Apparently, she's connected to those troublemakers who've been organizing protests. Can you imagine? Thomas Harrington married to a radical? Angela gripped the sink, staring at her reflection. Elizabeth had somehow discovered her recent involvement with the alliance. What had been meant as a source of strength was being twisted into a weapon against her. When she returned to the table, she found Thomas in a heated discussion with Mr. Richardson about the merger. Your personal choices reflect poor judgment, Richardson was saying. The board needs stability, traditional values. Traditional values? Thomas's voice rose slightly. Like treating people as property? Denying them basic dignity? Thomas, Angela touched his arm gently. Perhaps we should leave. The drive home was silent, heavy with unspoken concerns. Finally, Thomas spoke. I'm sorry. I should have prepared you better for their cruelty. No, Angela replied, her voice stronger than she felt. We needed to see it, really see it. This isn't just about us anymore, is it? It's about everything that needs to change. Thomas studied her profile in the passing streetlights. The woman beside him was different from the quiet maid he'd fallen in love with. She was emerging stronger, more determined, finding purpose beyond their relationship. Elizabeth's doing more than just spreading rumors, he warned. She's trying to paint you as a threat to everything they hold dear. Angela nodded, thinking of Dorothy's words about authentic symbols. Maybe it's time to be exactly what they fear. Someone willing to stand up and speak the truth. The car turned onto their street, but both knew they were heading towards something much bigger than themselves. Their love story was becoming entangled with a larger fight for justice, and neither could predict where it would lead them. Dorothy's voice rang out across the community center as Angela addressed her first public gathering. Segregation doesn't just exist in law, she declared, her hand steady on the podium. It lives in whispered conversations at social clubs, in denied job applications, in the invisible barriers we're told never to cross. The crowd, mostly working-class women and civil rights activists, listened intently. Angela shared her story, not just of her marriage to Thomas, but of her years working in houses where she was seen but never truly acknowledged. They call it tradition, she continued, gaining confidence. But tradition is just another word for fear. Fear of change, fear of losing power, fear of recognizing our common humanity. After the speech, Dorothy hugged her. You've found your voice, she said proudly. And more importantly, you're helping others find theirs. News of Angela's activism spread quickly through New York's elite circles. Thomas received concerned calls from board members, but instead of distancing himself, he made a bold decision. He began declining invitations to social events where Angela wasn't welcome, choosing instead to attend community meetings and support her growing involvement in the civil rights movement. Elizabeth watched these developments with calculating eyes. During a private lunch with her lawyer, she outlined her concerns. "He's not just embarrassing himself anymore," she stated coldly. "He's actively supporting radical elements. The company's stock has already dropped 3 points. The divorce proceedings are complicated," her lawyer warned. Thomas has significant leverage, and now with Angela's growing public profile, Elizabeth cut him off. "I'm not interested in complications. I want results." She pulled out a folder. "I've had someone following them. Angel has been meeting with known activists, attending protests. Surely we can use this." Meanwhile, Thomas worked late in his office, reviewing financial reports. The company's conservative investors were pulling back, nervous about his association with civil rights causes. He'd lost 2 major contracts in the past month alone. A knock at his door revealed James Patterson. "The board's calling an emergency meeting," James announced grimly. "Elizabeth's been busy. She's convinced 3 major shareholders that your behavior is destabilizing the company." Thomas loosened his tie. "They can't force me out. I built this company." "No, but they can make things very difficult." James sat heavily. "There's more. Elizabeth's hired private investigators. They're looking into Angela's past, her family, everything." That evening, Thomas arrived at their apartment to find Angela surrounded by protest signs and leaflets. Her face glowed with purpose as she described her plans for an upcoming march. "I've never seen you like this," he observed, mixing them both drinks. "For the first time, I'm not just fighting for us," she explained. "Every day, I meet women who've been told they can't cross the line society's drawn. If we can show them it's possible." Thomas sat beside her, taking her hand. "Elizabeth's escalating things. She's hired investigators." Angela's grip tightened slightly. "Let her investigate. I'm not ashamed of who I am or where I came from. The board meeting tomorrow will go how it goes," Angela finished. "We knew there would be consequences. But running a company that supports inequality, is that really what you want anymore?" Thomas considered the changes of the past months. He'd seen Angela transform from a quiet, careful woman into a powerful voice for change. And in the process, he'd begun questioning everything he'd once taken for granted. "No," he admitted, "but the company employs thousands. I have a responsibility to them." "Then show them a better way," Angela suggested. "Show them a leader who stands for something more than profit." As they talked into the night, neither noticed the car parked across the street, its occupant carefully photographing everyone entering and leaving the building. Elizabeth's plan was moving forward, piece by piece. In her mansion, she reviewed the latest reports from her investigators. A cruel smile played across her lips as she read about a discovery from Angela's past. A detail so explosive it could destroy not just Angela's credibility, but the entire foundation of her new life. "Oh, Angela," Elizabeth murmured, pouring herself a celebratory drink. "You should have stayed in your place. Now you'll learn what happens when you try to rise above your station." The city slept uneasily that night, as if sensing the approaching storm. In their apartment, Thomas and Angela held each other, drawing strength for the battles ahead. But some battles, they would soon learn, can't be won with strength alone. Sometimes the past reaches out with unforgiving hands, demanding its due. The manila envelope landed on Angela's desk at the community center with a dull thud. No return address, just her name in typed letters. Inside, she found photographs, old, faded, but unmistakable. They showed her father, Marcus Miller, at a Communist Party meeting in 1947, his face earnest as he raised his fist in solidarity. Her hands trembled. The Red Scare might have peaked in the 50s, but its shadows still loomed large. Along with the photos came newspaper clippings about her father's arrest during a labor protest and documents suggesting he'd fled to Mexico, abandoning his family to avoid imprisonment. "You never talk about your father," Dorothy said quietly, having noticed Angela's distress. "Because he died when I was young," Angela replied automatically. the story she'd told for years. But Dorothy's knowing look made her add, "At least, that's what I let people believe." The truth was messy. Her father had, and died. He disappeared after the FBI started investigating labor organizers in their neighborhood. Angela's mother had changed their name, moved them across the country, and built a new life from scratch. The shame and fear of those years had shaped Angela's careful, quiet existence until now. Across town, Thomas faced his own crisis. A board member had forwarded him the same information about Marcus Miller, along with a formal letter expressing concerns about communist infiltration in the company. "They're calling for your immediate resignation," James advised, pacing Thomas's office. Elizabeth's played this perfectly. In this political climate, any hint of communist connections. Thomas stared at the photos. "Did you know about this?" "No, James, honestly." "But Thomas, this isn't just about Angela's father anymore. The FBI still maintains files on suspected communists and their families. If this goes public, every contract, every government connection your company has could be destroyed," Thomas finished. His mind raced through the implications. Thousands of jobs at stake, decades of work undone. And Angela, would she be investigated? Blacklisted? He found her in their apartment that evening, surrounded by the scattered contents of the envelope. Her face was drawn, but composed. "Elizabeth sent copies to everyone," she said without preamble. "The board, the Women's Alliance, even the local newspapers." Thomas sat heavily beside her. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I've spent my whole life trying to forget," Angela replied. "After Dad left, Mom made us promise never to speak of him. She was right. Look what happened to families who were labeled communist sympathizers. No jobs, no homes, children taken away. We need to get ahead of this," Thomas said, slipping into business mode. "Release a statement distancing yourself." "From my own father," Angela interrupted sharply. "He fought for workers' rights, for fair wages, for dignity. Yes, he attended some Communist Party meetings. Back then, they were the only ones who seemed to care about working people's struggles. He wasn't perfect, but he believed in something." Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "Angela, you don't understand. The board's demanding my resignation. The company's stock is plummeting. Everything I've built is built on a system that crushes people like my father," Angela finished quietly. "Maybe that's why we found each other, Thomas. Because deep down, you knew something needed to change." Their conversation was interrupted by a call from James. Elizabeth had scheduled a press conference for the following morning. She planned to publicly denounce Angela as a communist infiltrator who had seduced Thomas as part of a larger plot to undermine American businesses. "She's painting you as a victim," James explained to Thomas. "A respected businessman manipulated by a radical's daughter. If you act now, publicly repudiate Angela, maybe we can salvage something." Thomas looked at Angela, still holding her father's photograph. The woman he loved had been shaped by struggle, by the fight for justice that had cost her family everything. Now he had to choose his empire or his conscience. "Get me in that press conference," he told James, "but not to repudiate anyone. It's time people heard the truth about what we really stand for." As he hung up, Angela touched his arm. "You don't have to do this. We could leave, start over somewhere else." "No," Thomas said firmly. "Your father had the courage to stand up for what he believed in. It's time I did the same." Outside their window, reporters had already begun gathering, drawn by rumors of the scandal. Tomorrow would bring either destruction or redemption. But for the first time, both Thomas and Angela felt truly aligned in their purpose. The past wasn't just haunting them. It was pushing them toward a moment of truth that would define not just their future, but perhaps the future of others who dare to challenge the system. The protest march drew hundreds to Central Park, with Angela standing among the leaders. Signs demanding equal rights and fair treatment rose above the crowd. Police officers watched nervously as the diverse group moved through the streets, their numbers growing with each block. "Remember, we remain peaceful," Dorothy instructed through a megaphone. "Our strength is in our dignity." Angela led a chant about justice and unity, her voice carrying across the crowd. But from the corner of her eye, she noticed men in dark suits photographing participants. The FBI's presence was unmistakable, a reminder of her father's fate. Halfway through the march, Elizabeth made her calculated appearance. She emerged from her limousine, flanked by reporters, directly in the protesters' path. "Mrs. Miller," Elizabeth called out, her voice carrying. The use of Angela's maiden name was deliberate. "Or should I say Miss Miller? Since your marriage to my husband isn't exactly legal, is it?" The crowd hushed. Angela stepped forward, conscious of the cameras clicking around them. "Marriage laws that discriminate are unjust laws," Angela responded clearly. "Just like the laws that kept my father from fighting for workers' rights." Elizabeth's smile turned predatory. "Ah, yes, your father. Marcus Miller, the communist who abandoned his family. Tell me, did Thomas know he was marrying into a family of radicals? Or was that part of your plan?" "My father fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves," Angela replied, her voice steady. "Just like we're doing now." "You're fighting for attention," Elizabeth snapped, "using my husband's name and money to promote dangerous ideas. But I have proof of exactly who and what you are." She gestured to one of her assistants, who began distributing folders to the reporters. Inside were not just the photos of Marcus Miller, but fabricated documents suggesting Angela had been part of subversive groups, that she deliberately infiltrated the Harrington household. The reporters swarmed, shouting questions. Camera flashes created a strobe effect as Angela stood her ground. "Is it true you're a communist agent? Did you seduce Thomas Harrington as part of a larger plot? Are these protests communist organized?" Dorothy pushed through the crowd, trying to reach Angela, but the press had formed a barrier. Police began moving in, citing concerns about public safety. Thomas, watching the scene unfold on a television in his office, felt his chest tighten. The company's stock was in freefall. Board members were calling for emergency meetings. But seeing Angela stand dignified amidst the chaos, he knew what he had to do. "Get the car," he ordered his driver. James grabbed his arm. "Thomas, don't. The board is meeting in an hour. If you show up at that protest now, then what?" Thomas challenged. "They'll fire me? Take my company? Some things matter more." He arrived at the protest just as the situation was deteriorating. Elizabeth was orchestrating a perfect media circus, playing to every fear and prejudice of the era. But when Thomas pushed through the crowd toward Angela, the reporters fell silent. "My wife," he announced clearly, taking Angela's hand, "is not a communist. She's a brave woman who's shown me what real courage looks like." Elizabeth's composure cracked. "She's using you, Thomas? Her whole family are radicals, troublemakers. Her family," Thomas interrupted, "fought for basic human dignity. Something you wouldn't understand, Elizabeth." "You're throwing everything away," Elizabeth hissed. "For what?" "Some misguided crusade. No tomas replay. For justice. For change. For love." The photographers captured the moment. Thomas and Angela standing united, Elizabeth's mask of control finally slipping, the protesters gathering behind them in support. It would become an iconic image of the civil rights movement. But even as reporters scrambled to reframe their stories, Elizabeth's eyes held a dangerous gleam. She still had one card to play, a truth about Thomas himself that would shake everything to its core. As the crowd began dispersing, she approached them one last time. "Enjoy your moment of glory," she whispered. "Tomorrow, everyone will know exactly who Thomas Harrington really is. And darling," she added to Thomas, "your father would be so disappointed in how you've used his name." Thomas's face paled slightly. Elizabeth's words held a threat he'd never imagined she'd dare to make. Angela felt his hand tighten in hers, sensing that beneath their public victory lurked an even greater challenge. The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the park. They had won the day's battle, but Elizabeth's parting words hung in the air like storm clouds gathering. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new challenges to face. But for now, they stood together, surrounded by allies, finally fighting in the open for what they believed in. Thomas spent the evening organizing an unprecedented event, a charity gala supporting civil rights initiatives, hosted at the Harrington Mansion itself. It was a deliberate statement, opening those exclusive doors to activists, community leaders, and people Elizabeth would have never allowed past the gates. "The invitations are sent," he told Angela, reviewing the guest list. Leaders from every major civil rights organization, union representatives, journalists, and your board members? Angela asked, noting the mix of names. They'll have to choose, attend and show support, or be conspicuously absent when the papers cover it. Thomas smiled grimly. Either way, they make a statement. But as they planned, James burst into Thomas's study, his face grave. We have a problem. Harrison Cooper is pulling his investment. Harrison Cooper wasn't just any investor. He owned significant shares in multiple Harrington enterprises. More importantly, he was notorious for his segregationist views and connections to organizations opposing civil rights. He's not just pulling out, James continued. He's threatening to reveal something about your father's business practices in the 30s. Something about discriminatory lending policies. Thomas's jaw tightened. My father's past isn't my present. No, Angela interjected softly, but it's part of what brought us here, isn't it? The system that benefited your family hurt families like mine. The weight of this truth hung heavy in the room. Thomas had inherited not just wealth, but the complex moral legacy that came with it. Meanwhile, Angela had her own confrontation to face. She requested a private meeting with Elizabeth, choosing neutral ground at the Plaza Hotel's tea room. Elizabeth arrived precisely on time, perfectly composed. How brave of you. Meeting me alone. We need to end this, Angela stated directly. Not for me, not for Thomas, but for everything this fight represents. Oh, darling, Elizabeth's smile was cold. You still think this is about you? About your little romance with Thomas? This is about power, order, the natural way of things. There's nothing natural about oppression, says the maid who seduced her employer. Elizabeth stirred her tea delicately. Tell me, does Thomas know about your visit to Mexico last year? The one where you met with your supposedly dead father. Angela's cup rattled slightly against its saucer. How did you? I have resources, dear. Lots of them. Elizabeth leaned forward. Just like I know about Thomas's father and his complicated business decisions. The question is, do you know? Has he told you how his family really built their fortune? Before Angela could respond, Elizabeth produced a thick folder. Consider this a wedding gift. Some light reading about the Harrington family history. You might find it illuminating. Angela left the meeting shaken, the folder heavy in her hands. She spent hours reading through documents detailing decades of discriminatory practices, questionable deals, and systematic oppression, all contributing to the Harrington fortune. When Thomas returned home that evening, he found Angela surrounded by the papers. Were you ever going to tell me, she asked quietly, about my father's practices? I've spent years trying to change how we do business. No, Angela interrupted. About your real father, the one Elizabeth threatened to expose. Thomas sank into a chair, the facade finally cracking. How did she find out? The same way she found out about my father in Mexico. Angela moved to sit beside him. Thomas, no more secrets. If we're going to fight this battle, we need the whole truth. He nodded slowly, looking older in the fading light. My father, my real father, wasn't Richard Harrington. He was Marcus Williams, one of the first black men to practice law in New York. He and my mother, they had an affair. When she got pregnant, Richard Harrington, her husband, covered it up, gave me his name, raised me as his own. Nobody ever knew. Angela sat in stunned silence, the pieces falling into place. That's why you were different. Why you saw me as more than just a maid. Maybe, Thomas admitted. Or maybe I just fell in love with an extraordinary woman who showed me what courage really looks like. The gala was 2 days away. Elizabeth knew Thomas's secret. Cooper was threatening to expose the family's past. And somewhere in Mexico, Angela's father was still fighting for justice, unaware that his daughter was now at the center of a battle he'd helped start decades ago. The mansion's preparations continued, flowers arriving, caterers planning menus. But beneath the surface, both Thomas and Angela knew they were preparing for more than just a party. They were setting the stage for a confrontation that would either destroy them or become a catalyst for the change they both sought. The night of the gala arrived, transforming the Harrington mansion into a symbolic battleground. Crystal chandeliers illuminated an unprecedented mix of guests. civil rights leaders mingling with business executives, community activists alongside society figures, all watching each other warily. Dorothy Williams arrived early, accompanied by other Women's Alliance members. "The press is outside in force," she warned Angela. "Elizabeth's been giving interviews all afternoon." Angela, dressed in a simple but elegant blue gown, nodded. "Let her talk. Tonight isn't about her anymore." The event began smoothly enough. Thomas delivered a powerful opening speech about change and responsibility, announcing the creation of a new foundation dedicated to civil rights causes and equal opportunity employment programs. The initial donation, half of his personal fortune. "The time for sitting quietly in our privilege is over," he declared to the mixed reactions of the crowd. "We must acknowledge our past to change our future." But halfway through the evening, Elizabeth made her calculated entrance. She wore black, like a widow in mourning, and moved through the crowd spreading poison with every word. "Such a lovely sentiment. Thomas trying to buy absolution," she remarked loudly to a group of board members. "Almost makes you forget about the Harrington family's real history. Or should I say, the Williams family history?" The whispers spread quickly. Elizabeth had positioned herself perfectly, dropping hints about Thomas's true parentage while simultaneously highlighting the company's discriminatory past. She was trying to destroy his credibility with both sides, painting him as a hypocrite to the activists and as an illegitimate heir to the business elite. Thomas watched her work the room, his jaw tight. "She's turned this into a circus," he muttered to Angela. "Then let's give them a real show," Angela replied, squeezing his hand. She approached the small stage where the band was playing, asking them to stop. The room fell silent as she took the microphone. "Many of you came here tonight expecting scandal," she began. "You won't be disappointed. Yes, there are secrets in the Harrington family. Yes, there are skeletons in their closets, just as there are in every powerful family in this city." The crowd shifted uncomfortably as Angela continued. "But tonight isn't about the past. It's about choosing what side of history we want to be on moving forward. My own father had to flee this country for fighting for workers' rights. Thomas's father." She paused, looking at him for permission. He nodded slightly. Thomas's biological father was Marcus Williams, a brilliant black lawyer who fought against the very system that the Harrington fortune was built on. Life is full of such ironies. The son of a civil rights pioneer, raised in the heart of privilege, now standing here trying to bridge two worlds. The room erupted in murmurs. Elizabeth stepped forward, triumph in her eyes. Finally, the truth comes out. The great Thomas Harrington, nothing but a man choosing to use his position for change, Angela cut in. Someone willing to acknowledge the past while fighting for a better future. The crowd's reaction was mixed, shock, disapproval, and from some, particularly the activists and younger guests, growing appreciation. Thomas joined Angela on stage, standing proud despite the revelations. "My father, Marcus Williams, fought for justice through the law," he announced. "Richard Harrington, who raised me, built an empire through practices we must now change. I am the product of both worlds, and I refuse to choose between them." The support from the civil rights leaders was immediate and vocal. Even some of the business executives, seeing the shifting tide of public opinion, began to nod thoughtfully. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. She pushed toward the stage, her composure finally cracking. "You think this changes anything? You're all still living in my world, playing by my rules." "No, Elizabeth," Thomas replied calmly. "Your world is ending. The rules are changing. The question is, will you change with them?" The room fell silent, waiting for her response. Elizabeth looked around, suddenly aware that her carefully maintained power was slipping away. But as she opened her mouth to speak, a new figure appeared at the mansion's entrance. An elderly man, lean and weathered, with Angela's eyes. Marcus Miller had returned from Mexico, drawn back by news of his daughter's fight. The past wasn't just being revealed tonight. It was walking through the door, ready to shape the future. Elizabeth's face went pale. The final act was about to begin, and for once, she hadn't scripted it. Marcus Miller's entrance silenced the room. He walked slowly through the parting crowd, decades of exile evident in his measured steps, but not in his proud bearing. Angela's hands trembled as she watched her father approach. "I read about you in the papers, daughter," he said softly, reaching the stage. "You're fighting the same battle I fought, but you're doing it better. You're doing it in the open." Elizabeth, recovering from her shock, seized what she thought was another opportunity. Marcus Miller, the communist agitator, returns to corrupt another generation. "No, Elizabeth," Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying a new authority. "Let me tell you who Marcus Miller really is." He pulled a folded document from his jacket. "In 1947, he worked with my biological father, Marcus Williams, documenting discriminatory lending practices. Practices that helped build the Harrington fortune." The room stilled as Thomas continued. "My father, Marcus Williams, was preparing a landmark lawsuit. But before he could file it, he died in what was ruled an accident. The evidence disappeared. Except, he held up the document, for the copies Mr. Miller protected all these years in Mexico." Elizabeth's composure cracked completely. "You're lying. Richard Harrington would never—" "Richard knew," Thomas said quietly. "He knew about my real father, about the lawsuit, about everything. That's why he raised me as his own. Not just to cover up the affair, but because he wanted a chance to make it right. In his final years, he told me the truth and asked me to do what he couldn't, change the system from within." Angela took her father's hand, understanding flooding through her. "That's why you came to work at the mansion," Marcus said. "You felt drawn to it, didn't you? Something about the house, about Thomas. Life is a way of bringing things full circle." Dorothy Williams spoke up from the crowd. "The children of two men who fought for justice, finding each other, continuing their father's work." Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "How convenient. A perfect little story of redemption. But the board won't stand for this. The shareholders have already voted." James Patterson stepped forward, holding up another document. "Emergency session this afternoon. Thomas retains control of the company, with a mandate for modernization and equal opportunity employment." "Impossible," Elizabeth whispered. "The world is changing, Elizabeth," Thomas said. "You can change with it, or you can step aside, but you can't stop it." The revelation of Thomas's true parentage, rather than destroying him, had transformed the night into something powerful, a moment of genuine reconciliation and commitment to change. Business leaders who had come expecting scandal found themselves drawn into discussions about practical reforms. Civil rights activists who had been prepared for confrontation discovered potential allies. Marcus Miller addressed the crowd, his voice strong despite his years. "I left this country believing the only way to fight injustice was from the outside. My daughter and Thomas are showing us another way, changing the system from within, bringing people together instead of driving them apart." Elizabeth stood alone now, her weapons of secrets and scandal rendered powerless. The carefully maintained social order she had defended was crumbling around her, replaced by something new and uncertain, but filled with possibility. "The divorce papers are ready," Thomas told her quietly, "along with a fair settlement. Your choice. Sign them and be part of the change, or fight and be remembered as the last defender of a dying prejudice." In the end, Elizabeth's signature on the divorce papers was as much a symbol as everything else that night. The old order giving way to the new, not through violence or revolution, but through the quieter courage of people choosing to do what was right. The gala evolved into something more than a charity event. It became a beginning, with business leaders and civil rights activists forming committees, making commitments, starting the hard work of real change. Thomas and Angela moved through the crowd together, no longer a scandal, but a symbol of the future they were all working toward. Later that night, in a quiet moment, Angela found herself between her father and her husband. "What happens now?" she asked them both. Marcus smiled. "Now, daughter, we build something new, something your children can be proud of." "Our children," Thomas added, taking her hand, "will grow up in a different world than we did. Not a perfect one, maybe, but a better one. One worth fighting for." The Manhattan skyline glittered beyond the mansion's windows. The same city, but somehow changed, just as they all were. The battle wasn't over. Real change never comes easily or quickly. But that night, in that house, they had proved that love could bridge the deepest divides, that the past could be faced without being repeated, and that the future belonged to those brave enough to imagine it differently. Elizabeth's car pulled away from the mansion for the last time, carrying with it an era that was ending. Inside, the work of building something new was already beginning, guided by the unlikely love story of a maid and a millionaire who had dared to imagine a world beyond the boundaries others had drawn for them. The end was really just another beginning,